It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Taylor, who is a partner with Bordner, Ladner, Gervais LLP, specializing in investment management and securities law, advising client companies, foreign and Canadian advisors, and dealers and fund managers. Michael is involved with BLG's Vision of Client-Focused Reforms Initiative and many BLG projects with the securities regulators. He also volunteers with BLG's Read to Kids program and their client counseling competition. Michael, thank you for agreeing to speak at this Ontario branch Chartered Governance Institute of Canada CPD event, and I look forward to learning from your presentation.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that introduction, and Kathleen, and thanks for the CGIC for inviting me and having me. It's very much appreciated to talk about, a topic that is very much, I would say, top of mind, just overall in the news media, elsewhere. It's just something that we're hearing a lot about, and I think people are sort of getting more and more interested in, and that is environmental, social, and governance. I'm going to start sharing my screen so everyone can see my my presentation here. So I think I really wanted to unpack this concept, because it's one of those phrases that's thrown around a lot. And so, we really want to kind of unpack what it means and what it means to corporations and governance. There's a lot of regulatory focus on it as well, which we'll get into. And just sort of trying to understand it in the framework of what's happening in the world today. I mean, just an example is cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency, to mine cryptocurrency, uses a lot of energy, so resources. And so, is that really, if you are a kind of like a green ESG investor, is that really something that is something that you can invest in? Well, everyone else is. Why are you being you being left out? So that's just one example, and we're going to get into a lot of this this afternoon. And as Kathleen said, please, I want it to be I want questions, discussions after the presentation. So please feel free to send your questions, and we can address them at the end. So I'm going to advance my slide here. I wanted to start off, maybe with some first principles to sort of ground the discussion and provide a bit of context about, traditional, let's call it traditional corporate governance, and sort of what it means. And really, when you're talking about, and I'm sure everyone actually on this call knows more about this than me, but when we're talking about traditional corporate governance, we're really talking about the role of the board of directors. I mean, and that's just so key, because that really is the main function of the board. It's really their core role to set that overall governance perspective for the entire organization. And it's grounded in really the fiduciary duties that directors have under corporate law, to act in the best interest of the corporation. And that really is from a legal perspective, that really is the highest duty that you can have under the laws, to be a fiduciary, because it does mean you have to always put the interests first of the other party ahead of yours. And something I think we're going to talk about, is going to be a theme throughout the presentation, is this best interest. What does that really mean? What is the best interest of the corporation? And traditionally, the focus there has been really on shareholders, so enhancing shareholder value, and that was sort of, I think, traditionally seen as really the role of the corporation overall, was really to enhance shareholder value. That's changing, or has changed, and I think that's sort of one of the things that's allowed, in Canada in particular, ESG to come to a bit more prominence, is because the Supreme Court of Canada, and then there's been legislative change of at least the Canadian Business Corporations Act, to allow directors to look at other interests, and so we will touch on that right now. So as I said, objective of the corporation really is, from a governance perspective, is to allow the board to discharge their fiduciary duties and act in the best interest. It does, there are, I think one of the things that people don't always appreciate is that, we do, when you say a corporation, there are different types of corporations. So, have not-for-profit corporations would be example. And so they would always have had a different, kind of mission or objective. For instance, it's really, fulfilling the purposes or objects of that not-for-profit corporation. But otherwise, generally, again, shareholder value and the interests of the shareholder traditionally, took prominence when we were talking about the best interests of the corporation. 2008, that changed in Canada with the BCE decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, which said that, you can look at other interests, or, to act in the best interest of the corporation, directors look at other stakeholders that might be involved. So shareholders plus other stakeholders. And that's led, I think, to a bit of a sea change in Canada. And the Canadian Business Corporations Act was amended to basically say directors, you can look at a variety of factors. So interests of shareholders, employees, retirees, pensioners, creditors of the corporation, consumers, governments, the environment. So that's interesting, I think, very, very much so for our discussion here. The directors, when acting in the best interest, can look at the environment, and that's in the actual statute. And then also the long-term interests of the corporation. So again, we're seeing this a legal evolution that is sort of, I think, reflected overall in a lot of societal changes as well. Before moving on to ESG a bit more in particular, I just wanted to sort of provide this slide, which I think it's actually one of my favorite slides, because I think it sort of summarizes really nicely sort of a framework for governance, and really what the directors can do and what the corporation can do to allow for effective governance, or effective board performance. So, we're concerned about the quality of the board, and that's basically, who's on the board, what are their skills, what are their experience, what are their education, what orientation do they receive? A big thing that's getting focus, and we'll touch on, is sort of refreshing the board, not having a stale board or board members who have served for a long time. So all of these things sort of go into who is on the board, and what are their sort of experiences, and what are their skill sets, and what are their proficiencies. Obviously, it's important also to define what the board, does, what the board's role is. And so, governance, as we've spoken about, is paramount. But other things, sort of, the overall strategic plan of the corporation, where the corporation is going to be going, is obviously something that the board also has to think about. Financial matters, risk matters, supervising the CEO, and stakeholder communication. Which again, I think it's something that is taking on more and more prominence as corporations start to, become quote unquote activists, or more so on social issues. And, there are examples that we've seen recently, having a plan from the board. And this is, in particular, very, very well known, brands or corporations, in terms of responding to social and other issues that, consumers, media is interested in, is something, a board really does have to consider. And then also, the third thing is how the board goes about its business, and the structures that are in place. So the committees, meeting procedures, all that sort of thing, and the overall relationship between the board and management obviously is also key. So with that in mind, that sort of background and context, because obviously all of this discussion has to be framed by that kind of overall kind of corporate governance. But with that in mind, let's turn now to ESG. This is again, it's one of those things that's thrown around a lot. It's a sort of topical. People talk about ESG, but like, what does it really mean? I mean, and I think it is very much kind of like a catch-all sort of amorphous concept, but it's sort of getting at a range of different approaches, to take into account in the investment process, environmental, social, and governance considerations. So it says that in particular, when I'm investing, or let's say a pension plan's investing, they want to know that the company that they are going to invest in and give money to is a good corporate citizen. They have considerations to address these matters, both internally at the organization and also how they interact with the outside world. So, for instance, an investor that's focused on environmental concepts will look at climate change and that, policies about climate change, disclosures about climate change, overfishing, deforestation, health, sort of tobacco. So all those things would matter to that investor. And they would probably say, well, I'm not going to invest in, you oil company or you tobacco company or some other polluting company because of how, the products, that kind of thing. So that's sort of, the environmental piece of it. Social, you look at a variety of things, but, examples would be, what kind of employer is this company? How do they treat their employees? Are they fair? What's the relationship to the society at large? Are they promoting values that, are desirable from a societal perspective? And so, this is sort of diversity, inclusion, for instance, would be an example. And again, an investor might look at, well, what are the company's policies in particular on these matters? How do they go about internally at the organization promoting these things? And then how do they interact with the outside world on some of these matters in terms of services provided, products, that kind of thing? Governance, I would say, is kind of more the traditional things that we were talking about or have been talking about. So, is the corporation committed to protecting shareholder rights? Do they have transparent and fair policies on management compensations? And do they align those with stakeholders, shareholders, generally? So this is sort of, all of these things go into, a criteria or something that's established to guide an investor in their overall approach to investing. And ESG, we also sometimes refer to it as responsible investing, sustainable investment. All those kind of things are, I think, sort of similar kind of concepts, and sort of all very related. So why are we seeing this now a very much increased focus on ESG? I mean, I think societal changes, societal norms changing is obviously a huge factor as we understand more about environment, health effects of certain products. So if we understand more and more about climate change, and more people think that's a significant issue, that's going to drive how they deploy their money and how they want to deploy their money. Legal changes, as I spoke about, this sort of shift from shareholder value to sort of overall stakeholder consideration, I think, is a big part of it. Tied to that would be regulatory expectations, and we'll get into this in more detail. But I'm a securities lawyer, and a very much a significant focus of the Canadian securities regulators, so the Ontario Securities Commission, but also south of the border. And there's been a few recent things we'll touch on from the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, on climate in particular, but also other ESG issues. I think also, like anything, academic kind of research builds up over time, in terms of, at least in theory, that ESG focused type investing can actually increase shareholder value. I think sort of there's research sort of supporting that. And there was an article I was looking at from the Mann Institute from December, and basically they summarized a variety of studies, but one in particular, which was like a meta study looking at 2,000 previous other studies, found that about 90% of those studies found that ESG does not impact performance negatively, and that the majority find that it's actually a positive impact. So, I mean, that's still, I think, debatable, and that's certainly not my area of expertise. But I think, academic research is sort of going more and more, and at least there are studies to support that this sort of ESG type investing, and companies that focus on this as their overall goal or mission don't actually suffer really performance wise. But again, it's still sort of something that's a bit up for debate. And I think, it's to the point now where a company, and in particular a public company, can't really ignore this anymore. Like, I think maybe in the past, people were sort of dismissive of some of these sort of ESG factors and considerations. But I think we're at the point now, given the societal pressure, the regulatory pressure, and especially from some prominent investors, a company that wants to succeed now really cannot just ignore taking into account ESG. So related to ESG, again, this is sort of one of those things where we're dealing with different terminology, but it's sort of very much the same thing as sort of this idea of corporate social responsibility. And this sort of, I sort of see as, you're being a good corporate citizen as a corporation. And the sort of the idea here is that corporate social responsibility is a self-regulating sort of business model, meaning that the corporation, regulates itself and chooses to do this, that helps it be socially accountable. So the idea is through these sort of CSR programs, the corporation will engage in different, philanthropy efforts, volunteer efforts, and overall to sort of do things that will benefit society overall. And, also doing that boosts its brand. So it's, you're being a good corporate citizen, you're getting good press, good publicity, and that sort of, enhancing your overall brand. And so an example would be, Starbucks, I think, has recently been committed to doing, different things in this space. So, I think they've been committed to hiring refugees as employees, reducing the environmental impact of their, their cups that they use, engaging in sort of environmental leadership. And the whole idea there would be that, they are doing things to be socially responsible. But then also, on the flip side, might say, because of that, you investor who are interested in investing in a corporation that's doing all these things, you can come to us because we are doing things in a socially responsible way. Another example is a personal one. A few years ago, well, more than a few years ago now, when I was an articling student, I was seconded at a sort of a very large cola company. And one of the things that we did on one morning, basically all the employees in the office, we went to a park nearby and we cleaned the park up sort of as a volunteer thing. And it was sort of, a nice team building thing, but obviously we're volunteering and promoting, environmentally responsible, behaviors and activities. And I think they, tweeted about it and sort of publicity. So again, you see, it's kind of like the corporation is doing things to be a good, socially responsible corporate citizen, then also, trying to boost its brand in that regard as well. So just touching more on sort of why we're seeing, some of these changes, again, as I said, societal changes in terms of political, social, economic changes, I think are changing societal norms. So people are just now more attuned to this. COVID, we can't go through this presentation without mentioning COVID. The COVID pandemic, it has exacerbated a lot of economic and other inequalities in society. And it's interesting. The securities regulators are very much focused on COVID and how companies have or securities firms, I'll call them, have done throughout the pandemic and continue to do. And it's, a question that's coming up on a lot of regulatory reviews and audits. And the OSC released a study on April 12th, actually, that sort of overall showed a significant impact on investors and retail investors. So they surveyed 2,000 Canadian investors, and they found that 3 in 10 Canadians said that they would be unable to afford an unexpected expense of $5,000, and nearly half of investors who were saving money or putting money towards a specific goal, like saving for retirement or travel, that kind of thing, have stopped doing that during the pandemic. And this is, I think, the most critical thing for our purposes in terms of, exacerbating this inequality piece, is that 58% of households earning less than $50,000 per year stop contributing to one or more savings goal. So again, this is just showing that these trends are accelerating for, when we face a pressure like a COVID-19, and we're seeing a gap more and more. So, I think there's then an interest from the regulators, from other associations to say, let's be more socially responsible to sort of close some of that gap. And then I think just, there's more and more awareness of companies, social media, that kind of thing, about the higher expectations of their conduct and accountability, just beyond the confines of the corporation and their shareholders. So social media, getting publicity for corporations. And an example I was thinking of was the south of the border with different voting laws that are being proposed, and the one in Georgia. And I think in the past couple of weeks we saw some very significant corporations based in Georgia come out, with their views on it. And I think it was sort of, a lot of it was spurred on by the expectations that people publicly were putting on these companies to sort of address some of these issues. So other things, technological change obviously is always significant. You see remote learning, AI, different automated processes, changing the way we work, with also remote working. All of these things add pressures to corporations. Gen Z, so the people that are in school now, or university, I guess I would say, are more socially aware and more attuned to some of these things, and sort of will be driving a lot of this. Again, awareness of climate change and pollution. And the last one I think is interesting is sort of shareholder activism, because traditionally shareholder activism, the idea is that an investor might come along and say, "Oh, you company, you're underperforming financially. I'm going to come in, swap the board out, change things up to increase the value, because I think otherwise you might have a good thing going." So we saw, I think generally there's sort of reports saying that in 2020, not surprisingly because of all the uncertainty, generally that kind of shareholder activism was less significant. Although people sort of expect after the pandemic, as we start to recover, that might uptick. But one of the trends that was seen in 2020 and perhaps before is that even companies that have solid financial performance may actually face activist campaigns because of ESG themes that in 2020 took more prominence and might continue. Because again, an activist investor might come into a company and say, "You're really failing on this kind of social or environmental matter. We're going to come in, address that, and by doing that, perhaps also enhance the value of the corporation." And so I think, a lot of oil companies, particularly American and European, have sort of faced some of these things that are being sort of pressed to lower emissions by different groups, backed by some, significant pension plans and other investors. And so, I think we're also seeing a trend, probably in the, not in Canada necessarily, but in the US and elsewhere, where ESG sort of focused activist funds are becoming more and more prominent. So again, this is all something that's going to drive change at corporations because they're scared of an activist campaign. And so it does say that from a board's perspective and from a governance perspective, a board has to really think about their ESG policies, criteria, how they're just faring on that front, in the event that they might face one of these sort of campaigns or attract some sort of attention from activist investor. So I did want to go into now some detail about, because I think, driving a lot of this change and driving how corporations and especially public corporations govern themselves and adhere to higher governance standards is regulators and, securities regulators in particular. And I think really the Canadian regulators are playing maybe a bit of catch up. I think with European, I think the market there and the regulators may be a bit more advanced, but this is definitely something that in North America we are seeing the regulators really take note of, is sort of the ESG. So in February of this year, the acting chair of the SEC came out with a direction to the staff of the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US to sort of really start enhancing their focus on the company climate related disclosure. So when the company's filing a document, really companies have to be aware that they're going to face more scrutiny from the securities regulator in the US. In Canada, we'll talk about in a second, but of their climate change related disclosures. And it's really based on a 2010 guidance from the SEC that they're looking to update. And really they're sort of going to look at compliance with the 2010 guidance and assess whether firms are actually addressing these matters and look to sort of provide more updated guidance to companies. And an interesting quote from the release basically says that, now more than ever, investors are considering climate-related issues when making their investment decisions. It's our responsibility to ensure that they have access to material information when planning for their financial future. So that's interesting because, the disclosure regime that public companies would typically face and, directors would and management would be involved in terms of setting a structure for that disclosure was focused really on material financial matters. But we are seeing a change. So we're sort of seeing a regulatory focus now to say that's not enough. You have to consider, climate related, in particular, risks of your business and provide disclosure if it's material to your investors, so they can make investment decisions knowing that information. So again, this is a driver we're seeing. And this is sort of picked up from a risk alert that the SEC just put out on April 9th. Again, highlighting a lot of deficiencies, weaknesses, and best practices that they want to see for a securities advisory firm that might be sort of in the business of providing ESG related strategies. And so the SEC has done a review of these firms and sort of highlighted things that they're going to be looking for in the future. And again, I think this is important for us to note here because a lot of the times when something happens in the US from a regulatory corporate governance perspective, it eventually finds its way here. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see something like this from our securities regulators. But the SEC is saying that when they examine firms, they're going to be looking at ESG related things in particular. So for instance, portfolio management things like due diligence. What kind of due diligence process is the firm engaging in when they're looking at their ESG strategies? Marketing is a very big thing, and we'll see that's been a focus of the Canadian regulators in a second. But when their website says something, or a presentation says something, or other marketing materials say something about ESG, are they really backing that up? Do they actually have a commitment to this when they are making or designing a product for people to invest in or recommending products for people to invest in? Do they actually, do their materials that they're presenting publicly align with what they're doing internally? And again, compliance programs, so compliance oversight. I think they're going to be focused on that to see if firms have compliance procedures, because in this notice, they noted a variety of compliance deficiencies at firms. So as I said, misleading statements about the ESG investment process, inadequate policies, weak or undocumented investment-related decisions for ESG, and just, programs are not in place to prevent sort of misleading things from being presented on ESG. And I think this is sort of like the idea of I think they call it sort of greenwashing, is that, a firm will do the easy part in that publicly on their website, announce and promote how ESG is a focus, that kind of thing, but not really in the background do the work to make sure that they're actually, providing kind of ESG type investments or other things to clients. So they're just sort of, overall trying to appear to be something that they're not. And so the SEC says, for effective practices, tailor disclosures, make it simple and clear and prominent about your ESG, about a firm's ESG programs. Explain how ESG decisions are evaluated on sort of a framework, and sort of how the goals that you're promoting align with that framework. And then, of course, I think we all know how important policies and procedures are and processes. So again, having a detailed investment policies and procedures to address ESG investing, and including specific documents and records is very much key here for firms. And as I said, I think it's important for Canadian firms to take note, because it wouldn't surprise me if this sort of floats up to Canada. Although we are seeing some things climate related from our Canadian regulators. So for instance, in August 2019, the Canadian regulators put out a notice to help firms assess climate related material disclosures. So when they're talking about preparing disclosure documents, this guidance sort of help firms frame how they disclose these material climate change related risks. And really the focus is on saying, firms, you really have to consider the financial implications of, for instance, the physical risks of climate change. So, resource availability, sourcing from supply chains, all those things could, because of climate change, be material impacted, and you have to, in providing material information to the public and investors, you got to consider that. Consider transitional risks. So, if we move to a more low carbon environment, how is that going to affect your overall business, and what are the risks of that to the business overall? And also, potential opportunities, disclosing opportunities. And when the regulators looked at, in a separate project, some of this disclosure in 2018, they found that of 78 companies or issuers that they looked at, only 22% provided boilerplate disclosure on climate change related risk. So, I don't think that's a great overall statistic. And so I think, again, that's going to sort of, motivate some change, and 22% provided no disclosure at all. So I think all of these things are things that we're going to see the regulator focus on more and more. And the Ontario Securities Commission, in its priorities, so it puts out, every year or so puts out its priorities for the coming years, and the priorities in 2021 included, this idea of a growing interest in investors in ESG, and how it is important for companies to provide sort of understandable but critical information to investors when they're making the investment decisions. on some of these factors. So, I think it's going to be something more and more we will see. And, important to note that it's not just climate change here in Canada. So the Canadian securities regulators have had a project going on for a few years now, or more than a few years, on women on board. So, representation of women on board of directors. And in this past March 2021, they put out the results of their 6-year review. So they had a review from 2015. They put out the results of their review from 2020. And the focus of the review is on sort of public disclosures of companies regarding women on boards and in executive positions. And they found, I think, a few positive things overall in terms of an increase from 2015. So they found the total number of board seats occupied by women increased to 20% in 2020 compared to 2015. So positive move there. And 79% of the issuers they looked at had at least one woman on the board, which is an increase from 49% from 2015. 6% had a female chair of the board. And over half of the issuers they looked at, so the companies they looked at, had a policy on representation of women on the board. So I think overall, again, we are seeing improvements here on this, sort of governance social issue, diversity and inclusion. And it would be something I think, regulators will press more and more on. And I think investors looking at some of these companies might want to see those companies take more action on this front to sort of improve that representation, but we will see. The last regulatory thing I just wanted to touch on is a marketing questionnaire. So the Ontario Securities Commission did this in December 2020, and also the BC Securities Commission did one in January 2021. But these are really what they call desk reviews. So they sort of send a questionnaire to firms. And in this case, there were firms that publicly stated that they had a connection to ESG investing. So like on their websites, were saying that they were ESG focused investors. And the idea was from the commission to get a better understanding of, what that meant and what the firms were actually doing. And so, there are about 7 questions ask of these firms to respond to. Describe firm the development process of your ESG products and the decision to include ESG in like the investment philosophy of the firm. Does the firm adhere to specific types of principles when investing for responsible investing? And so, a very prominent type of principle is United Nations principle of responsible investment. And so, the commission was asking in particular firms, are you adhering to this? Did you sign up for this principle? Again, what overall policies and procedures are in place? What is your research process look like for ESG in particular? What is your oversight framework for ESG investments? And I think, again, that's touching on some of the governance world here. What sort of oversight is the firm doing to meet its expectations when engaging in this, sort of internally at the firm from research perspective, but also publicly promoting ESG? Because that was, I think one of the main focuses of this questionnaire was saying, how is your marketing and public disclosure supported by what you do internally? So again, another example of an increasing regulatory focus in this area, and one that I don't think will be ceasing anytime soon. So, started off mentioning this about public companies and how, a public company really cannot ignore this sort of corporate social responsibility, ESG, in decision making. So in all of the decision making, when the board's making decisions, this is going to be a factor that has to be looked at, because I think someone could be an investor, could be a regulator, could be a consumer of the product, is going to be interested in this and, sort of make the company comply in one way or the other. And I think, a good example of that is a statement from November 2020 which was made by the CEOs of Canada's 8 largest pension plans, which represents, approximately together $1.6 trillion in asset under management. So, when they speak, companies listen, because that's, a nice chunk of money there that companies want to attract. And these pension plan CEOs basically said, companies and investors, please provide consistent and complete ESG information to strengthen the overall investment decision-making process, and overall, how society at large and these pension plans can assess ESG risk exposures. And a quote here from the statement I found interesting. They say, "We are committed to creating more sustainable and inclusive growth by integrating ESG factors into our strategies and investment decision-making." So, that's a signal there that these pension plans are, when they're making their investment decisions to deploy their assets in a target company, they're saying, we are going to be looking at these ESG factors. So company, if you want us to invest in you, you better get your act together and at least provide disclosure of these things that's, transparent and open, and also manage your company and your governance structures to take into account these ESG factors. And they did want the statement sort of said, we want some sort of objective, measurable standard. And there are sort of, there's a different standards that are sort of out there that you can measure some of these things against. So again, as I said, asset managers, investors are signing up to things like the Principles of Responsible Investing. 3,000 or so have signed up. This is just becoming something more and more that people are deploying capital to. So I think in July 2020, there was a report that said exchange traded funds, the global assets of exchange traded funds with ESG principles surpass US $100 billion. Overall, I think the estimate from 2020 is that ESG strategies exceeded $1 trillion globally. So again, this is something that is attracting investment. So companies have to take a notice of. One particular that's very interesting, mostly a European sort of right now. I don't think there's too much of this going on in Canada yet. Could be wrong. Is on the sort of green bond, blue bond, sustainability bonds, which are very popular in Europe, and I think are sort of, one of those things that is very oversubscribed. And these are sort of, these are bonds that, you can invest in, with the idea being that the proceeds of that bond, the capital raise, goes towards, different projects that have an overall positive environmental effect, or, a positive effect sort of on climate change. So, projects, that deal with energy, transport, waste management, water, land use, that kind of thing. All projects, though, that, people are raising money for, companies are raising money for, to have a positive overall effect on the environment. So, something that, we might see come to Canada, the sort of concept of a green bond. I wanted to sort of end where we started here, sort of going full circle on corporate governance, standards, and sort of contrasting, a report of where we were, and then sort of a report current today where we are. So in 1994, a committee was struck to look at, very significant, I think at the time, corporate failures in Canada, and questions around what the board did or should have done in those circumstances. And the ultimate report was called Where Were the Directors? And it was guidelines for improved corporate governance in Canada. And the report put out, I think, about 14 recommendations to sort of say, hey, this is how in Canada we should be improving corporate governance overall. And these recommendations were adopted by the Toronto Stock Exchange, sort of as principles that firms essentially had to comply with, or if not, explain why they did not comply with the different recommendations. And so, I think a lot of these things are familiar from the beginning of my discussion here about sort of, very basic, common sense, good principles of corporate governance. So, for instance, a majority of unrelated directors on a board, separate the chair and the CEO role, have outside directors on the nominations committee for the board. You should have a board committee that assesses the effectiveness overall of the board, an orientation program, and sort of clear descriptions of the role of the board and the CEO. So again, I think this was very influential at the time, and as I said, it was adopted by the Toronto Stock Exchange. So, all companies listed on the TSX have to either essentially comply or explain why they don't comply with, all of the principles. Fast forward to 2021, and this similar, I think one of the same authors, at least Peter Day, of that report, through U of T, the School of Business, put out essentially what's an updated version of that report, and it's kind of corporate governance in 2021. So it's called "Where Are the Directors in a World Crisis?" And the authors basically said that, we have this report from 1994, we have to update it, and we have to update it in the face of climate change, rising economic inequality, systemic racism, COVID pandemic. So essentially, we need to have a new set of guidelines that companies today should be, guided by in their governance principles. And what they want to is a similar kind of adopt or explain approach. So either company, and again, public companies most likely, but I guess any company can adopt these, either adopt or explain why you don't. And again, if you're a public company, again, potentially this could be something that the securities regulators look at, or the Toronto Stock Exchange looks at to make them do this. I did want to just go through some of the guidelines here that they proposed. There's 13 in total, but I do recommend it's an accessible report, and I recommend everyone can just Google it and read it, because it is good reading, sort of overall of the landscape of governance from what it was to what it is today, or what it should be today. So, corporations should have a corporate purpose. It establishes a purpose that addresses all stakeholders. And that's one of the things I think is important from this 2020 version of this corporate standards governance principles, is that we're talking about all stakeholders, and sort of, a corporation has to define who its stakeholders are. And it could be basically anyone that contributes to the operation of the corporation, or could be impacted by those operations. So again, that's pretty a broad scope of potential stakeholders there, but a corporation should be mindful of that in developing its purpose and developing some kind of definition that it can use for its stakeholders. The board's duty, it should be to exercise powers for the long-term best interest of the corporation, which the authors say by necessity should be considering the interests of all stakeholders. So again, we're seeing that concept sort of come to the front here. It's more than just the shareholders board. You got to look at other stakeholders as well. The report does speak to sort of a special emphasis or consideration on Indigenous peoples. So again, a corporation, you have to consider, the history and the unique rights that Aboriginal or sort of Indigenous peoples have when you're sort of engaging with them, with society more broadly. This is something that you have to take into account as well. Highlights the importance of reporting on stakeholder impact. So again, in annual reporting and other reporting, you should be reporting on this based on metrics that track progress in terms of different impacts on stakeholders, and suggestion that there should be a stakeholder committee to sort of assess how the company is doing, to make sure that, you know, a corporation is looking at all the stakeholder impacts, and then also a method process in place to resolve stakeholder conflicts. Because, you know, again, if you have all of these stakeholders and you're trying to balance everything, a corporation is going to have some sort of policy or process in place to sort of say, how are we treating everyone fairly when we're making these, you know, making these decisions? Compensation, obviously important, to align management compensation with the corporation overall. Board refreshment, as I said, there's a particular focus to make sure that boards today are kind of, you know, current with what's happening in society, and sort of making sure that you have some sort of term limits, revised skill matrices to assess board performance. Board and organizational diversity, again, the report highlights the importance of that, to sort of have policies and you know, targets in particular for the board on representation of women, and other groups that have been sort of underrepresented on boards, and also the similar thing for diversity overall. Climate change, you know, again, disclosure, the importance of disclosure of climate change and climate related risks. And the last thing is corporate activism. And so, as I said at the beginning, a board's role is to interact with the CEO and make sure that there's, you know, a plan for stakeholder communication for many of these, you know, ESG and other societal issues. And again, we saw the importance of that. Well, you know, I think every day we see the importance of this for a corporation to have a policy and a process to deal with these, sort of addressing these issues. So, you know, I think that's a great place to end it. Sort of this new updated 2021 corporate governance principles and guidelines for corporations to consider, to incorporate a lot of these things into their governance activities. So that was what I wanted to say, and happy to take questions. Kathleen, I don't know if we've had any come in.
Yes, actually, I have one from Anjali. He says, hello, Michael. Would you say COVID-19 has impacted ESG compliance? And how can board and management justify any ESG non-compliance in this situation?
I mean, I think so. Like, I think that it's a very good question, and I think it's one that I think COVID-19 has sort of really thrown a spanner in the works and just caused a lot of uncertainty overall, and highlighted a lot of issues, and I would say a lot on income inequality and how people work. You know, because if you're lucky enough to be able to work from home and sort of be uninterrupted, you know, you've had a very different experience than someone who has to go in day out to their job. And so, you know, I think a lot of companies where they have you know, frontline workers or that sort of thing, it's really been more acute, because they have to you know, how they treat their employees, what health benefits, sick days, all those things are harder to ignore now with you know, with COVID-19. So you know, if a firm or a company from a governance perspective just hasn't thought about this and has no plan to address some of these issues, let's say pre-pandemic, had no plans and no stakeholder communication policy and other things to make sure that all these things were addressed, you know, I think they probably have not fared well, and probably had a lot of catching up to do, and still might do during the pandemic. And I do think that was one of the you know, well, the report says that where the directors in a world crisis, that publication was partly motivated by COVID-19. And the issues that were faced. And so I think it's sort of saying to companies, you know, you've got to prepare for the unexpected and sort of this kind of level of of a situation, and your governance procedures have to take that into account. So here are some principles for you to consider. So yeah, I think overall there has been an impact, and I think it's very difficult for a company that's committed to governance to ignore it.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for Michael today? If so, just unmute your microphone or feel free to write something in the comment box. Oh, here's one.
Hello.
I'll read this. Oh, go ahead, William, and I'll read this after you're done.
Okay, thank you. I just wish to mention, thank you for Michael for your presentation, and I just wish to speak on one of the points that you raised about the debate on the costs and benefits. Because right now I'm doing doctoral study, and I'm actually trying to see if I can look into that particular factor, whether all these ESG initiative or something related to that, can we actually see the cost versus benefit? Because for your information, that in July last year, the Financial Times of Britain published 2 news articles. One is by Sir Ronald Cohen, who is working with the Harvard Business School to develop something they call the impact-weighted accounts, so that they can account for all these impacts in the financial statements, because what gets measured get managed. On the other hand, on the same day, the same newspaper published another article by Bradford Cornell, who is a professor emeritus of the UCLA. And he argued, and the title of it says it all. It says ESG is overhyped and oversold. So there are two different arguments, completely opposite on the same matter. So I think it is quite interesting to see, because what you're mentioning is the compliance as well as the capital access part of the matter. But when it gets down to the corporations, each of its own, it has to find a way to make sense of it. And if you cannot put it in a way that that can measure it and get it accepted and understood in a generally accepted way, much like the generally accepted accounting and auditing principles, people will try to find a way to fudge, because whatever I say is the truth. Right? So
Yep.
How do you get it so that all the investors, all the business executives would commonly understand and accept those things? This will become something of interest. So I just want to mention that and point it out. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, William. And I think that's a great comment. I completely agree with you. And I think that's one of the things that looking at some of these, regulatory statements and one of the pension plan statement that I mentioned, it's people are looking for some sort of measurable way. And so again, accounting perspective, securities regulatory perspective, how do you measure some of these concepts so people can understand them and see that there are benefits? So I think that is an area where there's probably work to do.
Great, thank you very much. Sabrina asks, have online board meetings versus in-person impacted ESG in light of COVID?
Interesting. I mean, I can speak to my experience. I would say no. Like I would say no overall. Like I think that's one of the things that the pandemic, again, working with clients that I work with, was actually surprisingly and thankfully seamless, was this transition to a remote environment. So I think that was thankfully something that, at least from an actual meeting perspective, hasn't impacted things. Now, I guess the question is, does having a virtual meeting versus an in-person meeting impact like the quality of the discussion and the debate? Because again, it's harder with a large group of people to have an open discussion. It's harder to hear people talk over each other. So maybe at that level it has, but I would say at least overall from a functional perspective, no. But again, maybe there's an impact on some of the quality of the discussion, maybe the ultimate outcome. But I think that would be an interesting thing to see if there's any sort of academic research or anything on that.
Okay, thank you.